Hello, my name is Teresa Fallon. I'm the director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, a think tank based here in Brussels, Belgium. I'm delighted and honored to be moderating today's panel, An Ocean Too Far, the Future of the Transatlantic Relationship. I want to thank Raisina for putting this together, as well as a Konrad Adenauer Stiftung organization. We're delighted today to share such a fantastic panel with you. Recently, on the 22nd of March, the EU announced sanctions in regard to human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And it was long expected that there would be counter-sanctions because, for example, the Chinese ambassador to Belgium had announced that this would happen and that they should think very carefully about these sanctions. So the EU sanctioned 4 Chinese officials in Xinjiang and 1 entity, the Security Committee inside Xinjiang. In response, the Chinese sanctioned 10 people in Europe, including MEPs, leaders of think tanks, and 1 entire think tank based in Germany. So this was kind of met with a great deal of concern and marked kind of a low point in EU-China relations. It's the first time the EU actually put sanctions on China since 1989 in the Tiananmen Square massacre. So is this meaning that there's a new period of transatlantic relations right after this Anchorage summit? Secretary of State Blinken flew to Brussels for a meeting at NATO, and that was followed by meetings with Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and also with High Representative Joseph Borrell on a discussion, EU-US dialogue on China. So even though the Biden administration has announced it wants to work more closely with its allies, it seems that there seems to be a revitalizing, maybe even sooner than expected, in the transatlantic relationship. So today we have an outstanding panel to discuss this topic with you. I have Wes Mitchell, the co-chair of the recently published NATO 230 report. I want to start with him today. We've had a lot of discussion on transatlantic relations, and there has been a big change in the last week. A week ago today, we had the EU announce sanctions on the PRC, and there were counter sanctions. And the set off kind of a chain of events that with Secretary of State Blinken arriving for the NATO meeting, followed by meetings with EU officials, and also the China dialogue, EU-US China dialogue. So it's been a momentous week last week for transatlantic relations. And I would like now to hand it over to Wes Mitchell. He was a co-chair of the recently published NATO 2030 report and has a real insight into how NATO has evolved in its perceptions on Russia and China. So I would like to ask you about Russia is increasingly cooperating with China. Will we see the EU and the US create a common front against China and Russia? And do you see NATO playing a role in that?
Well, thank you, Teresa, for the question, and also thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate. Look, I would put it this way. I would say, without a doubt, challenge from China, challenge from Russia call for an appreciable deepening of cooperation between the United States and Europe. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We have substantial shared interests. I would say, in particular, we share a fundamental and growing concern on both sides of the Atlantic about the implication of China's rise in particular. But the reality is, of course, that none of those interests or concerns have so far translated into a common political strategic agenda. I think that's partly because America itself has awakened to the problem of China in particular somewhat late. It's only within the last few years that we've really started to see the vocation of our foreign policy as being primarily to build a coalition to counterbalance China. In Europe, there's very well-known reticence about taking any steps that could seem to foreclose the European Union's options for an autonomous commercial strategic path. But having said that, I guess you could consider me an optimist. As you've just articulated, I think we do see signs of a gradual convergence. The Biden administration, I think it's noteworthy that the Biden administration has retained the Trump administration's focus on competition with China as priority number 1 and has made aligning with Europe vis-a-vis China a major foreign policy objective. The European Union, as Teresa, as you just pointed out, has designated China a systemic rival. A number of large EU states have tighter controls on Chinese technology and predatory investments than they had 4 years ago. And I think, by the way, the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for that. The big question I see is over the next few years, will there be sufficient alignment for the United States and European Union to coalesce around a common agenda? And the obstacles to that are well known. There are obstacles in trade and regulation, in digital commerce, new comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU just signed with Beijing or negotiated with Beijing. But I would say those obstacles notwithstanding, again, I'm optimistic that we'll see more and more of a US-EU convergence. And the reason for my optimism is not so much our own wisdom or creativity or sort of the foresight of the West, so to speak, but rather just the sheer fact of China's own aggressive behavior, its predatory economic practices, the increasingly strident approach of its diplomats, its military civil fusion strategy, and just the sheer scale of China's economic and eventually military power, I think will provide the glue or a kind of impetus that propel the United States and European Union to overcome their differences and come into more and more come into alignment. We're seeing the effects of that Chinese behavior in Australia, in India's outlook on China, and I think Europe is not immune. The European states, I think, will find themselves playing on very uneven commercial terms with China in the years ahead and being subject to intense political pressure. And so precisely for reasons of European self-interest, I think we'll see the U.S. and EU start to form more of a common front. So you could describe me as a tragic optimist. Briefly on the role of NATO, I would just say I think the conventional wisdom has been wrong. The conventional wisdom for some time now has been that China is not really the business of NATO, that it's primarily a commercial actor, that's obviously located in Asia. But I think what we're seeing is China's own behavior. It is more and more of a security factor. It's active in the Euro-Atlantic area. So the report that you mentioned, the NATO 2030 report, which I co-chaired with my wonderful friend Thomas de Maizière, it outlines a role for NATO on China that I think is prudential and exactly where it needs to be, and that is partly about strengthening the guardrails inside Europe itself against any Chinese activities that could affect the cohesion or readiness of allies in SACEUR's AOR, and then more broadly, providing a political platform where the countries of North America, Europe, Turkey can aerate their policies, so to speak, on China and coordinate with the European Union, even when NATO is not necessarily always operationalized for the task at hand. So in both of those cases, both of those roles, I do think the hour is late, but I see NATO starting to congeal around those agenda items, and I expect in the coming year, as NATO talks about picking up an update to the strategic concept, we'll see that formalized more and more.
Excellent. And I want to add that Wes Mitchell is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative and also a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. But I was so excited that we had an expert here on the NATO 2030 report. I led with that. So thank you so much. And I'll follow up with a few more questions with you. Now I'm going to turn to General David Petraeus. He's a partner with KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. General, with the new U.S. administration, what are the prospects for improved U.S. relations with Iran and the resolution of the Iranian nuclear issue? We had a big story over the weekend with China allegedly signing a 25-year deal with Iran. It grabbed headlines. I think there's a bit of hyperbole in some of the figures that they've been talking about, like 400 billion. But maybe you can shed some light on this new agreement and the relations in the Middle East.
Well, thanks very much, Teresa. It's great to be back with Ricina, even if it is virtually. As a former economics professor, I learned that you can never go wrong by answering a question with, it depends. And in this case, it very much does depend, mostly on Iran. The new U.S. administration has been very vocal about its desire to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. The other parties to that agreement would like to see it resumed as well. But the domestic political situation in the U.S. means that Iran likely has to take the first step. However modest, it does have to take the first initiative. The Biden administration does not want to be seen as overly conciliatory, but neither does Iran. And of course, elections are only a few months away in Iran. And so taking the first step may prove difficult in Tehran as well. Beyond all that, the U.S. is quite firm that there would need to be modifications to the JCPOA, extending the sunset clauses in particular, and also want to address Iran's support for malign activities of militias in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and also to address the increasing threat of Iran's missile program. So there's quite a bit to come to grips with here. And we seem to be at a bit of an impasse at present, and it's just not clear at present what might lead to steps by the two countries to break that impasse. It's clear that there's going to have to be some initiative of some type. Now, you mentioned these supposed deals. Again, I'd like to actually see what they say and to see how much is, as you say, hyperbole and how much is fact. At the end of the day, it does provide some relief to Iran, but again, without knowing the details of the agreement and how that will play out, it's hard to assess that. I don't think, however, that it provides the solution to Iran's problems, which are to say that the economy has been stagnant would be an overstatement. It has been really crushed by the sanctions very considerably. Iran's citizens are very dissatisfied with the situation in which they find themselves, particularly the young who are educated and can't find meaningful work. And so Iran does need to figure out how to get out from underneath the sanctions. But to do that, it's going to have to cease some of the malign activity that I've mentioned and also come back into compliance with the nuclear deal, which again is very likely to be extended in terms of the sunset clauses, without which the support by the U.S. and probably by some of the other parties will not be what is needed.
Just to make a quick follow-up on that, because with the Belt and Road Initiative, Iran is the key issue for China. So China has obviously been trying to cultivate very good relations with Iran. And I'm just wondering how this might work in the economic geography, because you have the JCPOA on one side, China is part of that, but China also has some really key issues in regard to the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think that that will be a problem, or that won't be a challenge for?
Well, I think it's another factor. Again, there are many key countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. Needless to say, China trying to connect other locations in the Eurasia landmass and really even to Africa with the so-called string of pearls, the Maritime Belt and Road Initiative. And there's even, of course, a digital Silk Road that is at work as well. So there are many, many different critical nodes and countries and locations. Iran would be a great addition to the Belt and Road Initiative. I would expect, for what it's worth as an aside, to see a response to that, by the way, in a more coherent fashion than we have seen before by a combination of the US, the UK, EU, Japan, and a number of other countries who will pool together their development funds and at least provide competition for the Belt and Road Initiative situations that China is bidding on, if you will, and trying to resolve. So that's another factor that I think is going to emerge here. We should also note that there have been many very ambitious Belt and Road Initiative initiatives taken, and by no means have all of them proven doable, and many are still very much in the early stages. So this just adds one more complicating factor or one more additional consideration as you assess what is already a many-sided problem. It's really a global set of issues. And again, you're going to have to see, I think, Iran take some initiative if they're going to get the Americans to come back to the table and sit down and discuss what is necessary to lift the sanctions, even if partially, and then to discuss some of the other issues that are so important to the United States and to our partners and allies in the region, as well as around the world.
Excellent. I'm moving on now to to member of the Bundestag, Jürgen Hart, who is joining us today. Germany has played a key role in the agreement of the principle of well, in principle, on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was signed in principle at the end of December. This kind of caused some problems, at least initially, in transatlantic relations, because the infamous tweet by Jake Sullivan kind of saying, wait, we're coming into office in 3 weeks, please postpone. Some people in Washington, D.C. saw this as an opportunistic turn. But now, after the tensions of last week with the counter sanctions, it appears that people who have been sanctioned in the European Parliament, 3 MEPs were sanctioned, and they were very careful. No, excuse me, I had that wrong. There are 10 people sanctioned, several of them MEPs, and they carefully sanctioned from each party in the European Parliament. So almost a death wish in terms of trying to get this passed, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment passed. So I would love to get your views. How do you see this happening? It's an important year for Germany. After 16 years in power, Angela Merkel will be leaving office. The elections will take place in September. How do you see this playing out?
First, I would like to thank for the opportunity to talk to you and to discuss with you such interesting questions with such a high-ranking panel concerning the German/European relations to China. I would like to go back to former times. We have good economic relations to China since decades. There's so many win-win in between China and Europe, I think also between China and US concerning the opportunities in trade and in business. But what we see in China since 10 years, which is the responsibility of the President Xi, that China combines its economic power with political pressure, especially on smaller and weaker states like in Africa, but also on states like in Europe. And we see activities like the Belt and Road Initiative, where we, from my point of view, the end of the Belt and Road will be close to my constituency in Germany. But I see, and I have nothing against good logistic lines between China and Europe. But looking to that, what China wants to reach with that project, I'm disencouraged. And I think also the 17 European states, European Union member states and others that are linked into that 17+1 initiative are more and more disillusionized on that what is in with that project. And I think China didn't reach its objectives with that project. The investment is far weaker than expected. And this shows that we have more and more question marks behind our relations to China. The reason for that decision of the European Union to have this agreement, this legal basis for investment, is what we have also on the US side. We want to have China back on track concerning following international regulations. I'm not 100% sure that what European Union wants to do now is fitting to that what is US already has with China. Or can be combined. And I agree with your position that at the moment there's no chance to pass the European Parliament with such an agreement, because the European Parliament is very much highly alerted concerning the sanctions regime China put on several members of the parliaments and on their families, by the way. It's not only members of parliament, but also family members. It was extremely more than Europe did against some people, I think 4 or 5 guys in China. And we have to face a new phase of confrontation with China on that field. I think everybody knew about that we might come on that closer to that point. And now we are maybe on the spot where we have to decide in Europe. And what I would like to see is a common China strategy of the European Union. We have cornerstones of that 2 years ago from the European Commission. I think good cornerstones for that strategy, but now we have to finalize or to build up that strategy. And the strategy only can work if it is synchronized with that what US and North America as a whole is done. Our leverage is much bigger if we cooperate, and I think everyone in Brussels and in Berlin knows about that. We have to synchronize our activities concerning China, and we will be successful with this. That I think, yeah. Thank you.
That's just a quick follow-up with that, because you mentioned the 17+1, and I understand Lithuania just recently announced that they're going to leave the 17+1, making it again the 16+1. And you mentioned this kind of disillusionment, but we also see increased relations with Hungary. For example, we know Hungary tried to water down the statement. There was a lot of horse trading going on. And as you pointed out, there are only 4 people in China connected to the Xinjiang, and 1 entity, which is the Security Bureau based in Xinjiang. So the kind of reaction pretty much from Beijing on Europe, I think it really, because they even sanctioned an entire German think tank which has expertise on China. So I think this pretty much shocked most of the population, thinking, we're not even allowed to talk about China. We can't debate China. We can't have, inquiry about it. And if you're an elected official, if you're an elected member of the European Parliament and you're not allowed to discuss it, I think this really was a red flag to many people. So where do you think the stumbling block is going to be? Because it appears that Hungary is often a blocking power, or they weaken proposals. That's the issue for the EU, to come up with a policy towards China, but it just seems that there are many, many hurdles. How do you expect this to improve in the next year or so?
The Chinese reaction on the so to say, very, very weak sanctions of the European Union and a first step is a test for us, I think. And it was possible to anticipate that, because China feels much stronger than European Union in that field, and they now want to show us that they can counter everything that we do with strong measures. And now European Union is obliged to find an answer which is not escalating the situation, but is strong enough to impress the government in Beijing. And it's difficult to find. I would appreciate if there would be already a China strategy, having that in mind. What will we do if they escalate the conflict? I'm sure that in the head of the president of the Commission and of the several heads of state of European Union, there is thinking about the further upcoming of the situation, but it's not yet formulated and not yet communicated and discussed in the Parliament. But I hope that we have an answer. We cannot step back now from our position. And we also cannot accept what they did against members of parliament and their families and this think tanks. We will cooperate with every of those politicians and with the think tanks. We will not. The German government will not stop communication and dialogue about China with this think tanks. And we will see what happens with the next trip of the Chancellor to Beijing.
Excellent. And I think that in Beijing's efforts to silence Europeans, they inadvertently lit a fuse, because everyone, I'm based in Brussels, and everyone is kind of, their heads are exploding. So moving to Brussels now, we have Stefano Sannino, the Secretary General of the European External Action Service. You've got a real hot potato coming up, because in April, the EEAS will publish, from what I understand, their Indo-Pacific strategy. So I'm curious, how will the EU engage with the US and other like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, yes?
Sorry, no, I thought you had not yet completed the question. Well, maybe before moving to the Indo-Pacific strategy, I would like to say a few words concerning our overall strategy vis-a-vis Asia, because it's, I would say, the Indo-Pacific strategy is part of a broader strategy that we are developing with the region, which is based on a number of strategic partners, starting with Japan, but also with the Republic of Korea, with the ASEAN countries, in spite of the difficulties that we may encounter at this stage with one of the members of ASEAN, Myanmar specifically, what I'm thinking about, but also the development of a much stronger relation with India, and we have scheduled a summit in May, which should, let's say, really give a big boost to the relations between EU and India. In this context, as you were mentioning, in April, we will present, let's say, a first outline of the strategy. Then the strategy itself will be more specifically, let's say, developed in the months to come. But we will try to look at the region from a different number of profiles: security, connectivity, research, and certainly, last but not least, the area of green and blue, so the fight against climate change. In this, I have to say that we need to also find a place for the relations with China. China is certainly a very complex partner, and as a matter of fact, we have developed a strategy already a couple of years ago, where we have defined China as a partner in a number of areas, as a competitor, especially from the economic point of view, and as a strategic rivals in terms of political approach. And we have seen a number of initiatives in all these areas, let's say, over time. We're trying to, let's say, to push the three elements at the same time, knowing that we have to manage the complexity of the relations with a country which represent in the second economy in the world, with all the power that this entails, and also the interest that this entails. And I have to say that we have seen, and I'm coming now to the US, we have seen a very strong interest on the US side to act exactly along the same lines. In the meeting that Secretary Blinken has had with the High Representative Borrell just a few days ago here in Brussels, China was exactly dealt in this context. And as you have mentioned at the beginning, we have a dialogue that we have started with the United States on China, where we are trying to, let's say, define all these different aspects and how we can face together the complexity of this relationship. And in this context, I have also to mention the multilateral area, because it's not irrelevant, the work that we are doing together in contexts like the United Nations, where building alliances is also an important element. You have rightly mentioned that when it comes to China, the issue of sanctions, which has been a very relevant point. We have to frame, I would say, the sanctions to China in the context of the overall set of sanctions that we were imposing on a number of countries. We were, for the first time, using a specific instrument that we had developed, a global human rights sanction regime. And through this, we have moved to a number of, let's say, targeted a number of violations in different parts of the world, in Russia, in China, in North Korea, in Africa, in Eritrea, in Sudan. So, I mean, in a way, it was a very broad approach that we were taking. And it is true that we were not taken by surprise by the retaliation that was coming from Beijing. More surprised, I have to say, from the fact that while our sanctions had, let's say, a very solid legal ground, this was, as a matter of fact, and it's been stressed, against the persons and against their freedom of expression and freedom of thought. And this certainly is generating a challenge to all of us. But it has been said, I mean, the point is not to escalate, is not to go, let's say, in a sort of tit for tat and continuing building up on sanctions, but trying to understand how we can manage to, let's say, get China on a more cooperative and constructive track. And again, this was also very much at the heart of the discussion between Blinken and Borrell. And it is really the point of the engagement. How do we engage with China, and how can we avoid of going into a sort of bipolar confrontation with EU and US on the one side and China and Russia on the other side. That said, I mean, there is a substantial reflection that we need to make from that point of view, also to guarantee a greater resilience to our societies. And the crisis that we've gone through in terms of the health, and the COVID-19 pandemic, and the battle in which we have found ourselves before with masks, now with vaccines, is telling about the need to rethink also this point that I was making about the resilience, the capacity of responding to the threats that are becoming much more complex, much more articulated, and where the concept of security is broadening a lot to cover a number of areas which are no longer the traditional ones that we used to know in the past. But the engagement with and the commitment to work with the US is very strong. I think that this is part of the overall redefinition and I would say re-engagement that also from Washington is very clearly has been very clearly expressed, where they want also to regain the trust, the confidence of their traditional allies. And for the time being, we have to say the expressions that we have seen in the manifestation of this determination is very strong, and certainly there is willingness on the European side to respond positively to it.
Well, thank you so much. But if I may ask a follow-up question, to paraphrase MEP Reinhard Bütikofer, he says you can't be a partner on Monday and then a systemic rival on Wednesday. So how does this work? I mean, haven't we moved beyond that? Hasn't the situation evolved so dramatically that this three baskets approach really is superfluous at this point?
I wouldn't say that it's superfluous. I think that we are not rival on Monday and partner on Tuesday. We are both rival and partner on Monday and Tuesday. I mean, it's the point, but that's the complexity of our world. I mean, we need to get accustomed to the idea that we have sometimes very difficult interlocutors, difficult countries, but they do represent also a very important part of the of our society. I mean, China is a permanent member of the Security Council, and this is not something that we are going to change. So we need to live with this complexity, and we have to manage this complexity, and this is what we are trying to do.
And we're also seeing economic coercion. I mean, it's not just the counter sanctions, but we've also seen how, for example, Swedish company H&M is being boycotted in China because they announced that they would not use Xinjiang cotton because it was through forced labor. So young people in China have been whipped up into a nationalist frenzy saying any company that doesn't source cotton from Xinjiang will be boycotted. So you have many European companies that are being forced to make a decision. Either they take slave labor cotton from Xinjiang or they don't. But if they don't, they have to leave China. So China's really forcing European companies to make a decision, aren't they?
Well, I mean, certainly, they are playing tough, and we are trying also on our side, to be naive in the way we approach them. I mean, when it has come, for example, to the 5G, our response has been very clear about the importance of preserving the space for and the security space for the European Union. But again, I mean, there is a huge amount of European investments in China. There is also a substantial amount of Chinese investments in Europe. I mean, for quite some time, China has been a sort of the producer for the world. That's why I'm saying that we need to certainly rethink in terms of supply chains to increase the resilience of our societies. But I think that we need to be careful about the idea of going to the extreme and thinking that at the end of the day, there is nothing that we can do with China, and the only thing that we can do is contain them or to oppose them on everything. There are areas where we need to work with China. Climate change is certainly one of those, but I mean, you were mentioning Iran, the Chinese also part of JCPOA. I mean, so there is an interest also to engage with them in a number of areas. So we need to be able to use all the different elements at our disposal in a very complex and difficult relationship.
And if I may, because of this situation with the mood in Europe now, can we expect tougher Indo-Pacific strategy? Because there seems to be a growing momentum to, instead of like a kind of watered down 27 lowest common denominator, do you think we'll have a more vibrant Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I don't know if I would say the common denominator is so low, because as I was trying to say before, we have done a number of things with Asia that goes that are giving the sense of very articulated strategy that we have for the continent, which again has necessarily to include also China, but at the same time has also to let's say use all the other tools that we have at our disposals, and to build all the relationship that we need to create in that region. I was trying to give you a sense of what is the strategy will look like, the areas in which we are going to work, and that includes certainly also the area of security, the area of connectivity, how to increase the connectivity between Asia and Europe. So I'm quite confident that the strategy will be substantial and will have a positive impact in the way we are approaching the relations with the continent.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your comments. We're all very eager to see what's in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And as we know, when you mentioned earlier about the FTAs with Japan and South Korea, but Europe has actually even intensified more their economic cooperation with the PRC, even though they have the free trade agreements with both Japan and South Korea. So there needs to be a diversification. And I think that hopefully this period. Okay.
It's true, but it's also true that I would say Japan has also established, like Australia and other countries, a trade relationship with China. Once again, I think that we need to be careful about, let's say, going to a sort of polarization or a binary line of reasoning where everything is black and everything is white.
Yes, but perhaps China's forcing us to choose. But Jürgen, you had your hand up. Please chime in.
I would like to add a comment on that question. We will have a fair supply chain law in Germany soon. I don't know the English term, but I think you know what I mean. A law where a company in Germany doing business with other countries have the obligation to look behind. Is there human rights violation, child employment or something like that in it? And then they have to act. It's not 100% strict, because there needs to be a relevance of the quantity of that element and so on. But at the end of the day, I think there will be a debate also in Germany and hopefully also all over European Union. If we stay close on that field, my expectation is the Chinese government, with its 2049 long perspective strategy, if they see that they come into a deadlock with their behavior against human rights violation with Uyghurs or in Hong Kong or Taiwan, they would try to find a way out. But it's necessary that we stay close and 100% proof on that field. And in that case, I think Chinese governance likes to bypass this part of their strategy and to find a way to handle that. And from my point of view, the most important thing is that we stay close together and that we are able to face the challenge and not to step back if there is counter pressure like it is at the moment with the sanctions on the politicians.
Well, I'm really delighted to hear about this. This is excellent news. As Benjamin Franklin said, we all have to hang together, or assuredly we'll all hang apart. So I think the unipolar moment is over for the U.S., and the U.S. is very clear under the Biden administration. It wants to work closely with its allies, and together they can have an effect on China's policy. We can help possibly shape it, but it seems like we're in a new era of China's assertiveness and self-confidence. I even read this morning how they're banning the Oscars now in Hong Kong because of a documentary that was made about the Hong Kong protests. And so there just seems to be more and more of a narrative of boycotting. And I think this is a worrisome trend, because even though people in Europe and the United States don't want to look at the world in a bipolar way, China is actually kind of forcing these decisions. And we even saw this recently with Hugo Boss. It's a German clothing manufacturer, and they kind of took off their website that they would no longer. They signed the BCI, the kind of free labor, not forced labor, cotton in Xinjiang, and so they were being boycotted. So then they kind of quietly removed it from their website. So there's real pressure for these companies to make decisions, and it's really a tough road ahead for all of them, especially the post-COVID-19 economic landscape.
My fear is that they will not only counter such activities by companies like you told, directly influence, but maybe that China says, okay, if Germany is doing, or European Union is doing that way, we increase the tariff on import of German or European cars to China by 10%. And this might lead to a tough debate in Germany. And if it might happen in August this year, for example, it will influence, might have an impact on the elections, because thousands and thousands of jobs are pending on that. But we cannot hide away from that confrontation. We have to find intelligent answers.
That's a good point. But I think that there's also this distortion of a perception of how reliant Germany is on the Chinese market, because from what I've read, it's only 3%. Of course, that's a lot when you have a whole population is reliant on trade with German trade with China. But I think that there is a bit of a distortion because there's been a lot of elite capture and economic coercion within Germany. So this perception that China is our only future, I think it's a bit of a distortion, and I hope more academics look into the real trade figures. But I think that you're right, that's going to be an August surprise, I think, for the elections in September. So I would just like to go back to Wes here. The big question for all of us is, what is the relationship between Russia and China? I mean, it's kind of mysterious. We saw with Secretary of State Blinken's visit, he arrived in Brussels on Monday. At the same time, Lavrov was going to China. The Chinese put it in the press saying, is it a coincidence? So kind of signaling that we've got other options. We've got, the Russians with us. How is this perceived? How do you see this? It's not an alliance, but how would you describe the Russia-China relationship right now?
Yes, well, I think the relationship is one of opportunistic coordination and deepening economic, political, and military cooperation. For years now, I think there has been this perception in the West that we only have a problem with Russia and China if they're in some sort of deep condominium or formal alliance. And of course, they are deepening relations, but I would posit that it almost doesn't matter whether they have a formal alliance or not. I think by dint of their geography as large Eurasian land powers, by dint of the fact that they're both led by despotic governments, they tend, on balance, to share certain interests vis-a-vis the West that I expect their leaderships will continue to prioritize over whatever differences they have between one another. So the idea that I've heard for many years, for example, that China and Russia have so many points of divergence between themselves that the West could somehow exploit those to gain an advantage in competition. I'm all for that if those openings present themselves, but I wouldn't hold your breath. I think the problem that the United States and Europe will have in coming years in the sort of this tandem, this geopolitical tandem of Russia and China, is one that the NATO 2030 report describes as strategic simultaneity. and it is the fact that each of these players benefit from the kind of distraction effect that the moves of the other would have vis-a-vis, I think, especially the United States in a military sense. If you look at the National Defense Strategy, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, it shifts the U.S. focus away from preparation, definitively away from the old focus on a two-front war, two major regional military contests at the same time, and begins to prepare the United States overwhelmingly for a military challenge from China. I think the reality is the United States will not have the military power in coming years to defeat China and Russia simultaneously, and that we could expect that any military confrontation in, say, the South China Sea would probably be utilized by China as an opening, by Russia as a distraction or opening to make a move in the Baltic, Black Sea. I hope none of that comes true, but I think we should plan on a reasonable basis for those contingencies. And what it tells me about the U.S.-Europe relationship is that more and more we will need a global division of labor whereby Europe takes more and more responsibility for handling Russia. I'm not advocating the United States leave Europe militarily or that we cease to be the primary deterrent against Russia in that theater. But I think the reality will be that more and more of our resources and attention militarily will be on the Indo-Pacific. And so the more that Europe can handle the challenge from Russia to enable that concentration on Asia-Pacific, not from the basis for the United States to leave Europe, but as a means of ensuring that secondary theater does not become a source of instability as we focus more on Asia-Pacific.
I know it's so complex, and I would love to dig more into that, but I'm watching, my eye is on the clock, so thank you so much for your insights on that. Turning to General Petraeus, because traditionally Europe is very concerned about the Middle East because it's close. How is this kind of movement of the Biden administration focusing even more on the Indo-Pacific? How do you see this playing out in transatlantic relations? And some people have talked about the forever wars. How would you see this as strengthening transatlantic relations, or do you see it weakening transatlantic relations? And what's the best way forward?
Well, clearly it is the right move to rebalance to Asia as the policy was described, really starting with the second Obama administration term, continued through the Trump administration, and very much now the focus of the Biden administration, with the increased emphasis of the new administration on doing all of this with partners and allies around the world. That said, there is no question that there are still vital U.S. and NATO and EU interests in the Middle East, in particular the free flow of energy resources out of the Gulf to the east and to the west, because that energy still does fuel the global economy. Certainly the U.S. is now a net oil exporter and has been for some time a net natural gas exporter. So this is no longer the kind of interest that the U.S. used to have in it. But again, as a major participant, as the largest economy in the world still, the U.S. obviously has a keen interest in the global economy being fueled by what comes out of the Gulf region. Beyond that, there are Islamist extremists. There is Iran trying to establish hegemony across the so-called Shia Crescent from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and down into southern Lebanon, and a variety of other interests that remain there, not the least of which is actually a degree of stability so that the U.S. and our allies don't get pulled back into the region in a very significant way. The U.S. and many of our NATO allies and non-NATO allies are still engaged in the greater Middle East in a variety of different ways. And now, if you expand that all the way to include Central Asia and Afghanistan, obviously, in fact, the coalition in Afghanistan now is larger than the U.S. Force presence. There are still forces in Iraq and in Syria and in a number of other locations across the Mideast, North Africa, and so forth. And all of these areas do pose challenges on which we need to continue to focus resources. I think the biggest lesson out of the last 20 years of war with the Islamist extremists is that they will exploit any ungoverned space in the Muslim world. We do have to respond to it because what happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but into all other countries put together. The U.S. generally has to lead it because of the paradox that the U.S. military capacity is vastly greater than that of all of our NATO. We don't just spend more than our 29 NATO allies. We now spend more than twice as much as all of our NATO allies. So I very much support the aspiration in Wes's discussion about the EU and NATO taking on more ownership. That's been a constant theme for every president during my 37 years of military service. But it has proven to be a difficult one, particularly for some of the most important countries in NATO to even get to 1.5% of GDP, much less 2%. So again, very much want to see that happen. But you have to deal with the world as it is. And in the world as it is, the U.S. is probably going to have to lead. You want a coalition of countries. I'm a huge believer in coalitions, having commanded the largest ever fighting coalition in Afghanistan. I agree with Winston Churchill that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And by the way, we should have Muslim countries in that coalition as well. But then we have to understand that you can't counter terrorists with just counter-terrorist force operations. You have to have a comprehensive approach, but we don't want to be the ones on the front lines with our coalition partners. We want host nation forces to do that. We want them to resolve the issues of restoration of basic services and local governance and repair of damaged infrastructure and so forth. And we've actually now been able to figure out how to do that in large measure because of the proliferation, this armada of drones that the U.S. and our coalition partners can put over top of our host nation partners to support them, to advise, assist, and enable, also with close air support that is very precise and so forth. And then the last lesson we need to come to grips with is to acknowledge that this is not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. It is the fight of at least a generation. So the forever wars, we have to recognize that you don't end an endless war by ending U.S. involvement in that war. In fact, the war probably gets worse. You end the involvement by resolving all of these underlying issues that lead to the kinds of conflict you see on the ground. And that can take quite a long period of time. But I'd contend that we now have figured out how to do that at a level with an efficiency that enables this to be sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure. And therefore, we should recognize, I think, that a sustainable interest is actually preferable to the kind of situation in which you think you're ending a war because you're ending your involvement in it. But then, as happened in the case of Iraq, we have to go back in after an extremist group is able to reconstitute itself and pose a major threat to that country and to its neighbor, Syria, as well. Those are the dynamics. But again, I want to return to where I started, which is the crucial importance, certainly, of shifting the focus, shifting the resources, shifting the emphasis, and also shifting the coalition effort, above all, to achieve a coherent, comprehensive, whole of governments with an S on the end approach when it comes to addressing this resurgence of great power rivalries as the national security strategy of the Trump administration announced. And of course, in that, the most important country with which to contend is obviously that of China, noting that I would like to see this, as I know the other speakers in this panel fervently want to see, is to see the U.S.-China relationship be a mutually beneficial relationship as much as is absolutely possible. But right now, there certainly seem to be pressures that are taking it in another direction. And obviously the other speakers have highlighted a number of those.
Thank you, General Petraeus. My eye is on the clock, and I asked each of you to come up with one suggestion on a way to improve transatlantic relations. So I'll start here with Jürgen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the remarks of General Petraeus. I saw you first time when you met the Defense Committee in Germany 10 years ago as a commander of ISAF at that time. I think there's a huge role for Europe, Germany, France, French-led European activity in Africa to replace what normally in former times US did by fighting against terror in the Sahel region. And we in Germany now discuss in these days about our significant increase of our activities in the Sahel region together with the Sahel states, just to show that we have answers on some of those questions you raised. This is what I want to say. Germany has to play a more important role because European Union members asked that from us, and I think we will take this responsibility. Thank you.
Excellent. And Secretary General Sanino?
Well, I think that the most important thing that we could do with the US is to create the Council on Defense and Security. I think that would be extremely helpful to discuss issues that are very relevant for both for the European Union and for the United States. I think that the complexity of the security situation in the world is such that it requires all our efforts joining in this perspective. And I think that all countries are relevant. I mean, I want just to underline that one of the largest presence in Sahel is from Romania. So it's important to mention that all countries can and have to contribute to the security of the European Union and of the world in general. So if we can manage to get out from a sort of almost competition between EU and NATO, which is not the case, and we go into a more cooperative spirit, that would be extremely relevant for everybody and for the security of our world.
All right, thank you. And General Petraeus, I have to follow that suggestion with your view on one suggestion for improving transatlantic relations.
Well, actually, I'm very much in agreement with what Jürgen and Stefano just said, frankly. I think it would be hugely helpful in the United States, as well as for the United States and the interests of the NATO and EU countries, if the EU and NATO would shoulder more of the defense burden. I would hasten to add here, though, that having seen a number of these initiatives over the years during my time in uniform, this should not be just another new headquarters and another new way of organizing the existing forces. Rather, it should represent new capabilities. And I can tell you that, as Jürgen mentioned, I was, of course, privileged to command this large coalition in Afghanistan at the height of the effort there. It included very, very fine German forces at that time. They conducted the first true combat operations since the end of World War II, although I'd also served with them certainly in the Balkans and in Cold War Europe. But these were real operations, and they were very, very impressive. And I would love to see, in particular, that kind of capability enhanced, expanded, and so forth, because that really should be the core of the NATO and EU contribution from that side of the Atlantic. And if that were to happen, you would actually see big benefits in the United States, where one of the criticisms has always been, well, why are we shouldering the burdens of others? Why are we, as I noted earlier, spending not just more than all of our 29 NATO allies, but more than twice as much as all of them? So again, I'm very, very strongly in agreement with what Jürgen and Stefano put forward.
And Wes, we started with you, so we're going to give you the last word. What's the best, or what's your piece of advice for improving transatlantic relations?
Yeah, I'll give you two. The first is I think the U.S. should pursue the idea from the recent European Commission report on a EU-U.S. Trade Technology Council, something that would allow the two to establish common standards and harmonization on emerging and disruptive technologies. I can't underscore how important it will be to have mechanisms like that so that the United States and Europe can take advantage of the aggregative data potentials that they have with their combined population. We're really going to need that in critical ways, militarily and economically, vis-a-vis China that is on path to have an economy larger than both the US and EU economies combined, and a population larger than ours combined. The key drivers in emerging technologies, it's all about being able to harness larger data sets and larger populations. So I would start on the trade and technology side. And then secondly, I will shamelessly stump for an idea from the NATO 2030 report, an idea that we got from Francois Heisborg, and it is the idea of NATO establishing a consultative body modeled on the Cold War era COCOM that could coordinate policy with the European Union and other bodies as needed on China. The caution, I would say, I'll end on a cautionary note that I think we just have to guard against this idea that the optic of conciliation, that we somehow conflate that for strategic success. I applaud the Biden administration for the right words about alliances. Alliances are critically important. I disagree with what Blinken said last week when he said this is not an us or them choice. I think it is an us or them choice, not about America versus China so much as the strategic and political West vis-a-vis China. And I think that will require some trade-offs, but I think it is a choice. I think it's an increasingly stark choice. But we can't go back to the world before to where we say a few symbolic wins, let's say some meetings of a community of democracies or revived EU-US summits. I think we're in new terrain where we really have to see specific measurable outcomes that lead to the West as a whole being better off in long-term competition with China.
Well, this has been such an interesting and timely panel. I'm so honored by Raisina to be moderating it with this and I'm incredibly privileged to be with these four outstanding speakers. It appears that the transatlantic relationship has got some momentum now. It's been revitalized, especially considering the current political landscape, especially with China's new assertiveness. So watch this space. Comprehensive agreement on investment will be a key issue as well that everyone will be watching. And as we see the new leadership in Germany, that will have a big impact as well on the future of transatlantic relations. So thank you for your time, all of your insights, and I'm so grateful. And watch this space on transatlantic relations in the future. Thank you.